G'day, ZiggyD here, back with some more Neverwinter gameplay and discussion for you guys. In this particular video I'm going to be talking about how much of a Dungeons & Dragons experience can you expect from Neverwinter. Now the MMO itself is actually titled Dungeons & Dragons Neverwinter, with Neverwinter being the main sort of working title that most people are going to refer it to. And you know, D&D fans are very familiar with the Neverwinter setting. There's been a few games based on the Neverwinter setting, and there's been other Dungeons & Dragons games, and even an MMO based on the Dungeons & Dragons franchise. And obviously this has a huge following in the tabletop gaming and even in the video games sort of industries. And you know, people come to expect certain things from Dungeons & Dragons games, you know, like things like dice rolls and certain types of gearing and certain types of you know, questing and all that good classical sort of RPG tabletop gaming stuff. So in this video I actually want to just talk about how much of that you can actually expect from Neverwinter, and maybe whether it will actually be a pleasing game to D&D fans. So the first thing I want to say is that the game is set obviously in Neverwinter, so it's in the city of Neverwinter, and you venture out into many of the classic locations from the original Neverwinter games and from the Neverwinter tabletop series and lore and all of that. There's a lot of good classic lore and setting in that, and it also looks pretty fantastic. So if you're just keen for a chance to, you know, take a stroll around in a pretty picturesque looking Neverwinter and, you know, explore the different things and, you know, get into that side of the lore, there's a fair bit of that in the game for you, so that's pretty cool stuff. The next thing is that the game does feature a selection of the races from the D&D franchise, and you know, the classic core races. You've got the humans, you've got half-elves, elves, half-orcs, dwarves, halflings, and even the tieflings. And there might even be some additional races in the future, but we'll see about that. I think drow might be coming possibly. The next thing is that the actual in-game classes, and this is kind of interesting, are derivatives of the core classes from the D&D franchises. So you've got things like, you know, you've got the fighter, the rogue, the cleric, and the wizard, but instead of just putting those in and then letting you spec however you want inside those classes, they've taken sort of like this subcategory of each of those classes and put them into the game. Now this is kind of interesting in the MMO sense because it means you don't have as much flexibility and choice over how you want to play like a fighter, for example, but it's interesting. Okay, so in terms of the fighter, there's actually two fighter classes in the game. There's the Great Weapons Fighter, which sticks to the two-handed swords. Unfortunately, no two-handed axes. I don't ask me why. And then there's the Guardian Fighter, which is like your sword and shield tank style one. Then in terms of rogue, you've got the Trickster Rogue class, who focuses on a mixture of stealth and, you know, sort of tricky combat, backstabs and things like that. In terms of the cleric, you've got a Devoted Cleric, which is very much about healing. And then in terms of the wizard, you've got a Control Wizard, so they focus on control spells and also some ranged pew-pew attacks. Now, obviously, if you're familiar with the D&D, you know, background and the core classes, these are, I guess, what you could call subclasses of those classes. And yeah, it's an interesting sort of setup, and it makes sense in the MMO, but it is kind of restrictive. So if you're planning on saying, you know, I want to play like a crossbowman fighter or something like that, you don't have the flexibility to do that, unfortunately. So that leads into my next point, is about weapons and gear in this game. Now this one was a bit of a letdown for me because you cannot expect anywhere near the flexibility in terms of gearing, and you know. So okay, when you go into D&D, you've got like 5 different types of options of bladed weapons, or, you know, many different types of options of bladed weapons, and a lot of it is stylistic. You know, there's many ways to skin a cat, essentially. You might have, you know, 5 different things that do 1d6 damage, and they all just do it a little bit differently. You don't have that flexibility in Neverwinter. Instead, you've just got the very traditional MMO style progression in gear. You know, you get a dagger that does 10 to 20 damage, then you get a dagger that does 12 to 24 damage, and you just keep going up through like that. And you're also, you don't have any choice over the actual types of weapons you pick. So for example, I'm playing the Trickster Rogue, and most of the time I'm using some sort of daggers or dirks, or, you know, things like that. And then as I was just progressing and upgrading, my next strongest choice, well, my next strongest weapon that I could get was kind of like a orc single-handed axe thing. So yeah, okay, that's a little bit of variety in there, but it's actually just a progression in terms of numbers, and there's no dice rolling in the game. So that, I guess, is sometimes I think when people go into D&D games, they expect, you know, some dice rolls and stuff in the background, like the actual Neverwinter RPG games, the single-player RPG games. You know, they had that dice rolling in the background, and your weapons did 1d6 or 1d8 or things like that, and you had +1 and all that good classic D&D jazz, but you cannot expect any of that from Neverwinter MMO. So the next thing is that the game does feature dungeons. Okay, that's pretty cool, but they're not D&D dungeons. They are very much, you know, your classic MMO style dungeons. Point A to point B, occasionally some little side rooms and things like that. There's like treasures. There's kind of things that are like your class roles. So in a game of D&D, a tabletop game of D&D, you might have, you know, your 5 different party members, and each one of those might be good at different things. So your rogue's going to do traps and stuff like that. And that does happen a little bit, but it's only kind of a minor part of the game. You know, and say like your warrior's got your strength focus, they might lift up a heavy door or something like that, and that can happen a little bit, and it results in a little bit more loot. There's no real puzzle solving, at least not that I've encountered so far in any of the Neverwinter dungeons. Very simple, but still kind of satisfying and fun, just combat-based dungeons. Nothing really the complexity and intrigue that you'd have in an actual D&D dungeon. So the next thing I wanted to mention was the Foundry. Now this is kind of where the big hope lies for people that want to get into, you know, some more interesting style of dungeon making, and, you know, maybe even want to experience a bit of the dungeon mastering in Neverwinter. This Foundry is something I've never really seen in an MMO before, and it's community created and curated content. So basically you can go in, be your DM, you can create a dungeon however you like it, and then you can upload into the game and other people can play that. Now, this is seems like a pretty flexible tool. I haven't had a chance to play around with it very much yet, and I tend to not be very good at the map making side of things on these sorts of games. But it seems like in the future, you know, in a couple months' time, people might be coming up with some very creative dungeons. I've played a couple of the Foundry missions so far, and they are probably better and more in-depth than the actual built-in, you know, quests and things that actually came with the game. So that's a good sign, because in the future that means we might be having much more, you know, interesting puzzle solving as people really push the limits of the Foundry system. So that offers a fair bit of hope there. But basically, the overall thing is that you should not really be expecting this to be a D&D game, and I really think it isn't a D&D game. It's an MMO that uses the Neverwinter IP. It uses the setting, the lore, and some of the familiar things that you expect from the game, and that's kind of cool. I actually don't really think that's a bad thing, because what Neverwinter does, you know, in terms of being an MMO, it actually does really well. So far, I've been having a lot of fun with it. Of course, I was a little bit disappointed that my daggers weren't, you know, 1d4, and then I didn't have the sneak attack 2d6 bonus or anything like that, but I was able to get over that pretty quickly because the game is actually pretty darn fun. Anyway, that's it for now. I'm ZiggyD, and thanks for watching.